So good afternoon and thank you very much. We are very pleased and honored to welcome Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Thank you very much, Professor, for accepting our invitation at the University Panthéon-Sorbonne. We have a very busy schedule this afternoon, so let's start. But before we start, let me thank some people, people without whom this event would not have been possible. So first of all, I would like to thank my colleague Pierre-Charles Pradier, who has been a great help in organizing the conference. Thank you also to Caleb Holman, who have been very helpful and very nice. I'm also grateful to my colleagues and friends, Isabelle Coupé-Soubéran, Jérôme Glachan, Constance Monnier, and Christophe Moussu. Finally, I would like to thank the LabEx Refi, especially Emmanuel Poul, the Sorbonne School of Economics, the Alliance Programme, and the student of the Master Communication Information in Economic and Finance, and the student association Partageons l'économie. Thank you for your assistance. So, Professor Stiglitz, you are in Paris for a couple of weeks. I hope you enjoy your stay, and I hope you enjoy our city. Indeed, you are very, very popular in France, you know. Your academic paper, your books are a constant source of inspiration for us and for our students. So we are very pleased to welcome you. And I don't know if you plan to come back regularly, but you will be welcome if you want to come back. You have given several conferences in Paris, but today we would like to focus on finance and society. Your position is very clear. Finance has contributed to creating a malaise, both economic, social, and political. Overall, you fear that banks will undermine democracy. It is a very strong concern, and we would like to listen about this topic. So, with Anne-Laure, my colleague, and my friend, with Anne-Laure, we have decided to organize the discussion around 5 main topics. The first one will be the role and the importance of finance in our societies. Second, a topic that is particularly relevant to me, the taxation of financial transactions. Then we'll discuss about bankers' culture, maybe. 4, tax haven, and lastly, if we have time, finance and climate change. Okay? This is the program, 5 main topics. And after that, some questions from the students, mostly. So first, finance and society. Is there too much finance? Maybe Anne-Laure has some question about that.
Okay, so very happy to be here, and I really enjoyed reading your book, which is amazingly well written, and it gives an amazing narrative on the political and the economic context. So, as Gunther was saying, we will start with finance and society, like the importance of the financial markets. And I'd like to touch upon the ambiguous role of finance. On the one hand, we all know that a functioning capital market is important for an economy and for the economic growth, but on the other hand, we have a growing evidence that financial market can actually have detrimental effect, and at least, the least to say, ambiguous effect. There are evidence about resource misallocation, boom and bust cycle, hysteresis effect of financial crisis. So we would like to know, for you, how can we fix that? Do we need financial markets? If we need financial markets, what kind of financial markets do we need? Is that a problem of size? If we fix the too much, too big, will we fix everything? And you also emphasize a lot in your book the importance of rent. Banks have sit on a huge rent. Do you think that fixing competition in the banking market and the financial markets in general would address this ambiguous effect of financial markets on the economic growth?
Yeah, so thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to be in this very beautiful room. Let me begin by trying to put it in maybe a macroeconomic perspective. That in the years before the financial crisis of 2008, the percentage of GDP in the U.S. economy that went that was in finance went from about 2.5% to 8%. And you asked, what were all these people doing? And this 8%, they were very well-paid people. And with all those resources going into finance, you would have thought that you would have gotten a better performing economy. What is the function of finance, as we usually talk about it? It is to allocate capital, one of the scarce factors of production, more efficiently. So you say you have all these resources, all these people engaged in making capital resources more efficiently allocated. And what happened? Growth slowed down. So their net output was negative. It wasn't positive. And what we got at the end was the financial crisis of 2008. And we got a very large increase in inequality, much of which was associated with finance because they got paid enormous salaries, but they were, one of the things that they were engaged in was exploiting poor people with predatory lending, abusive credit card practices, a whole array of activities. So that leads some people to say, well, why don't we just get rid of the financial sector? And you mentioned that at the end we'll maybe have time to talk about climate change, but one of the advantages of global warming is that Wall Street, the southern end of Manhattan, will be underwater. So that will be the end of Wall Street. But we'll have to pay them to move, but we'll come to talk about that later. But the fact is that you cannot have a well-functioning economy without a financial sector because you have to allocate capital well. Now, since the 2008 crisis, there's been a lot of discussion about strengthening regulations. But what is very interesting to me is that most of the discussion of strengthening regulations is about preventing the financial sector from imposing harms on our society. So regulations about excessive risk-taking that could cause another crisis, regulations to stop market manipulation like they did in the foreign exchange market, in the manipulating the derivatives markets, to stop the kinds of predatory lending practices that helped create the crisis, to stop some of the abusive credit card practices. But almost none of the discussion is going back to the foundations of why do we have a financial sector, and is there anything we can do to make the financial sector do more of what it's supposed to do? So, for instance, one of the things that the financial sector is supposed to do is provide finance to small businesses so that they can create more jobs and expand. But in fact, the lending to small businesses has actually come down, is not improved. One of the classically, if you read textbook stories, one of the functions of a good financial market is called intermediation, taking money from households and translating it to firms. So people who have excess savings can take those excess savings, and firms can use those excess savings to grow. Well, in the U.S., the financial markets have actually been engaged in disintermediation. That is to say, their major function has been to take money out of the corporate sector and give it to rich individuals. So just to give you an example of this, last year, there was not net new stock issues, but negative stock issues. It's called stock buybacks. $1 trillion of stock buybacks occurred last year. So this is money that could have gone to more investment, that could have gone to wage increases, went into the pockets of mostly very wealthy individuals. So to me, it's very clear that the financial sector is not doing what it's supposed to. Let me give you another example. When we talk about money, we talk about the importance of a means of payment. And today, with modern electronics platforms, it costs fractions of a penny to transfer. When you go to a store and you buy something, you can use a debit card or a credit card, and what that does is to send a message that money is taken out of your bank account and transferred to the merchant's bank account. That's part of a means of payment. That's a transaction that costs a fraction of a penny. But the banks, the financial sector, charges for that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% to the merchant. Why did they get away with it? Market power. They have an enormous market power. And to understand how they exercise that, it's very complicated. There are contracts that they sign with the merchants. They force the merchants to sign that says they can't charge for those services to the customer who eventually buys them, who benefits from them. They can't even advertise what they are. They can't let the customers know how much they are paying. The merchant is paying. In effect, what that means is if you use what they call a high rewards credit card that gives you a discount because you get money back, poor individuals who are paying cash are subsidizing rich individuals because inevitably that gets reflected in the price. And in the case of the United States, the Supreme Court says that's fine. It was a 5-4 decision with the 5 Republican justices, and they're not really justices, I don't know the right word, judges. The 5 Republican judges saying it's fine to be a monopolist and extract money out of ordinary consumers. So I've ranted a little bit long on this, but it is, the fact is that I think our current financial system is dysfunctional. It is a source of what is called rent seeking. It gives an enormous amount of profits to the banks based on exploitation of market power, individuals' ignorance, vulnerabilities, charging interest rates like 30% when the interest rate in the market is 0. I mean, what they do is I think reprehensible in so many ways. But so the bottom line of that, I think we need better regulation, both to prevent them from imposing harms on others, but also to force them to do what they're supposed to do. So when you talk about that regulatory framework, too big to fail, one of the topics is important, is an important problem, but it's only one. That's really concerned with excess risk-taking. There's also too interconnected to fail, too intertwined, too correlated to fail. There are a whole set of problems associated with our excessive risk-taking. But one of the problems is it's an insufficiently competitive financial market. And it's really hard to make it more competitive. There are ways of doing it. Australia's, in the credit card area, Australia just forbid the kinds of secret contracts that they have that lead to market power, and the result of that is they have a more competitive payments mechanism where the banks are extracting less rents.
if I may, if we think of the Eurozone and the imbalances that have been accumulating through this cross-border lending all along the first decade of the 2000s, can I push you? Do you think that more competitive French banks and German banks would have avoided more competition in these French and German banking sector would have avoided the accumulation of these imbalances in Spain, Portugal, Italy?
No. And some of those imbalances, remember, are basically macroeconomic imbalances. And the banks were just the mechanisms by which those underlying macroeconomic imbalances got actuated, affected. So in one way or another, those macro imbalances, to correct those, you need macroeconomic policies. But the microeconomics comes in that a better regulated financial system might not have taken the kinds of risks that it did in, lending in real estate in Spain. There was more housing construction in Spain than in, I think, almost all of the rest of Europe. And anybody looking at that saw that there was a housing bubble going on, just like when we saw so many houses being constructed in the middle of the Nevada desert. We said that's a little peculiar that there'd be constructing so many houses in the middle of a desert. And we knew that there was a housing bubble. And eventually we broke. It broke. So you need regulation. You also, I have to say, I think you need better regulators and supervisors. That's how, again, hard. But you have people like Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, saying, he's a good economist, but he took his models too seriously. His model said there couldn't be bubbles. So he read his model and said there can't be a bubble. So he said, well, it's too soon to tell whether there's a bubble. You can't be sure. Yeah, you can never be sure of anything. But there was a 99% of probability that there was a bubble. And guess what? There was a bubble. So the same thing it was true in Europe. Trichet was focused on wages being too high. Draghi talked about too strong of a welfare state. There was never a crisis because too strong of a welfare state. There was never a crisis because of too high wages. But there was a crisis because of irresponsible lending. And both Trichet and Draghi should have focused on regulating the banks. Well, that was their job, not pontificating about the welfare state or about wages. But it's easier to give lectures about what other people do than do what you're supposed to do.
If I may come back to the problem of competition, of course, competition is a concern, market power is a concern, but on the other hand, if we limit activities, regulation limits also competition. For instance, what do you think about the GlassSteagall Act? The GlassSteagall Act limits the competition between banks.
Well,
in finance and claims.
Yeah, the GlassSteagall Act was designed in some ways to avoid some of the conflicts of interest and actually resulted in a more competitive banking system. Because, for those of you who don't know, GlassSteagall was a bill that was passed after the Great Depression, and they did what were some of the problems in the Great Depression. And they said, we want to separate out commercial banks, those who take ordinary people's deposits and are supposed to manage them well and invest them safely. They separated that from investment banks, which is where rich people put their money, and they're focused on issuing equities, issuing bonds, high finance, high risk. And the view was that these are two different kinds of institutions, and when you bring them together, you have a whole series of problems. One of them was that you get a culture of risk-taking from the investment bank, and it infects the commercial banks, And you wind up with a very risky banking system, and that's exactly what happened. The second thing is you get conflicts of interest. The investment bank that issues a equity wants to be sure the companies that it sponsored in issuing the equities does well. And one of the ways it does well is to keep lending them money even when it's your stop. So you have these conflicts of interest, and that was one of the sources of concern when they passed GlassSteagall. In fact, under GlassSteagall, we had a fairly competitive banking system. And after we repealed it in the late 90s, our banking system got very uncompetitive. What happened is you had merger after merger, and there was nothing to stop that, and we wound up with about 5 banks dominating America's financial market, and that led to the too big to fail and excessive risk-taking. And if you look very carefully at where did the bad lending that led to the financial crisis in 2008 occur, at the center of it were our big banks. They were, and it wasn't the subprime lending as much as the lending to people a little bit above the bottom.
Your discussion about the size of the financial sector is very important. But today, most of the people here are students in banking and finance. And so we can take this opportunity. Maybe you have a message for them. Do we need more bankers or more engineers? What do you think about this?
More supervisor, actually.
More supervisor.
Yeah, maybe more bank supervisors. Yeah. I think a well-functioning society needs bankers and it needs engineers. But if I had a message to make, it is really connected with what I saw as the moral turpitude of our bankers. When they were students, they seemed just like ordinary people. And then something happens to them, and actually there's been some very interesting research in behavioral economics about this, done here in Europe, where they do these experiments on honesty. And the experiment goes something like the following. You roll a die. I'm giving you a simplified version, but it gets this story. You roll a dice, and if it's 1, you get $1. If it's 2, you get $2. 3, 4, 5, you get $5. Except 6, you get 0. Okay. Now you put people in a cube, in a cubicle, and you tell them nobody is watching them. Tell us the truth about what you got. And you can say, well, how do we know whether they're lying? Well, if you have a large number, as all of you who've taken statistics know, you should know these are not loaded dice in the way that the bankers would design them. These are fair dice. So you know that 1/6 of the time it should be 1, 1/6 2, 1/6 3. So you know exactly what the distribution is. So you can't tell whether any particular person lied, but you can tell whether, on average, there is a lie. Now, economists have a very strong prediction about what everybody should say. These are real payoffs people give. So economists say, what should everybody report? Most of you should be trained as economists if you're not bankers. Everybody should report 5. It turns out that people are not as dishonest as economists say they are, that you get a distribution. It's not the distribution that you would get if they were honest, but it's not the distribution that you would get if they were economists and totally dishonest. It's halfway between honesty and dishonesty. So that's the basic experiment. But now you take a group of bankers And the first thing is you discover that bankers are less honest than other people, systematically. But then, what is really more interesting from the behavioral economics point of view is if you get them on a Sunday morning and they've just come out of church, they'll be a little bit more honest. But there is something in behavioral economics which we call priming, which is before you do the experiment, you give them a brief discussion for a few minutes in which you remind them that they're a banker. You just give them the mindset, what is your job? I'm a banker. Where do you work? Not anything very complicated, but they start thinking, reminding themselves they're bankers. And the moment that you remind them that they're bankers, they become more dishonest. So these are experiments been done over and over again, and they say something about the culture of banking. So you ask, what is my recommendation? Remember this experiment if you go into banking, and do whatever you can to resist it, and maybe with your friends, get together to see whether you are in fact resisting the temptation of becoming a banker.
Thank you. Do you have a question? No.
No, I'm fine. I think we can go to the...
Actually, I'm very exciting because I want you to discuss about the financial transaction tax. I really like this topic because I think this topic is both relevant and important for our society. And 30 years ago, you published a very influential paper on that topic. Of course, in 30 years, things have changed a lot on stock markets, but this visionary and forward-thinking article is still very relevant. I'm really excited because in Europe, it is a strong debate. And if I can sum up the debate, there are two options. On the one hand, we can have a very ambitious financial transaction tax, including derivatives and high-frequency trading, first option. And a second option, a less ambitious financial transaction tax, like a stamp duty or like the tax we have in France. And my question is very simple. What do you think? What do you prefer? Yeah. A very ambitious but unlikely to be to be there, or a less ambitious one? What do you think about that, and what do you think about FTT?
Okay, so first let me give you a little bit about the basic principle of taxation and why in this article, say 30 years ago, and I'm glad you read it. I sometimes think some of those articles you write, nobody reads, but
my students have to read it.
Oh, okay. One of the basic principles of taxation is it's better to tax bad things than good things. So that's why it's better to have pollution taxes than to tax labor or savings. And so there are incentive effects, and if you can discourage bad behavior and raise money at the same time, it's a great thing to do. So that's the first idea. The second idea is that much of the activity in the financial market is rent-seeking, is socially unproductive. An example of that I wrote about more recently in a paper that I gave at the Atlanta Fed in 2015 is high-frequency trading. So high-frequency trading, I don't know if you know, are these, today in the stock market, the vast majority of trading is done by computers with other computers. And if you're only human, which I assume most of you are, there's no way you can compete with these high-frequency trading. In fact, things go so fast that if you're not co-located, that means if you're located across the street from the exchange rather than right upstairs of the exchange, the time it takes the electron to go across the street means you're out of the game. You're too slow. And to give you the nature, I was on a commission that was set up after there was what was called the flash crash, where in 20 minutes, something like $6 trillion of value was wiped off the US stock market. And of course, that was phony. I mean, it wasn't like anything real happened in 20 minutes, but the whole architecture of the equity market collapsed. And what they did then was a little bit outrageous. They just canceled contracts and canceled trades. It was a mess. So there was a commission appointed, and one of the ways to try to prevent that was a little regulation to say, if you make an offer to buy, say, I'll make an offer to buy a share at a given price, say $30, you have to keep that offer open for 10 milliseconds. Now, that's 10 milliseconds is not very long, but when I made that proposal, their response is, do you want to go back to the dark ages? But the point is, what is the social value of having markets that are going on that fast? No, there's no social value. There's no real decision that corresponds to a millisecond or 10 milliseconds. And all of this is a very sophisticated way of front running. Of trying to find out what other people's information is so you can use it to get the value of that information before they do. And it actually makes the stock market less efficient, less informative, and makes resource allocations worse. I think there's a good chance, and one of the reasons that there is such a good chance is there's actually a lot of money at stake. I think the estimate in the case of the bill that was just recently introduced in the United States, is that it would generate $800 billion in tax revenue between 2019 and 2028. You know, $800 billion is not a lot of money, but it's better than nothing. Yeah, you could do a lot with $800 billion.
We would like also to discuss about tax haven, and Anne-Laure is a specialist about tax haven. So.
Well, we're both produced a paper, and that's not every day that you can promote a paper in front of a Nobel Prize, so I'm happy to do it. No, in your book, you discuss 3 reforms to make globalization more fair, more with social justice, and one of them is actually addressing tax evasion. Which is, I mean, it's very encouraging because it has become on the top of the political agenda after the 2008 crisis, and it's totally justified. So let me just, for the students, let me just remind you some quite striking figures. Tax havens represent 1% of world population, 2% of the world GDP, but 40% of FDI, foreign direct investment, go through a tax haven. Meaning that most, at least a disproportionate amount of multinationals locate their profits in jurisdictions like Cayman. According to recent data, so that's when I promote our paper. So with Gunther, we've collected and analyzed some recent data on the commercial presence of European banks. And we put together some figures. European banks intermediate in total 5 billion euros of offshore deposits, which is 5% of their country of origin GDP. Their favorite destination to operate their offshore activity and the one of their clients is by far Luxembourg. And other data on FDI and portfolio capital show that Luxembourg is as important as Cayman Islands. So let's not put politics aside. How do you see the reform of tax evasion, the political agenda of tax evasion going forward with the OECD efforts and with this big elephant in the European room where one of the founding members is a major tax haven?
Yeah, and one of the geniuses is the president of the head of the European Commission, Juncker. And that was why they love him in Luxembourg. So let me also, you might ask, why is there so much banking in places like the Cayman Islands? And all of you in your economics course learned about comparative advantage, and you might ask, how does sunshine, there's a lot of sunshine in the Cayman Islands, is sunshine a big source of comparative advantage in banking? And the obvious answer is no, because Luxembourg has a lot of banking and they don't have sunshine. So that's clearly not but it actually, the point is, it's the opposite. It's the lack of transparency in these tax havens, fiscal paradises. That's important. And in some countries, the major source of foreign direct investment in India was Mauritius. So this is a really global problem, and it's Indians taking their money out of India, putting it in Mauritius, and putting it back in. The interesting thing is that much of the banking activity doesn't even occur in the Cayman Islands. It occurs in New York City. It's just recorded as if it would occurred in the Cayman Islands. And then you ask, why do we allow it? And the answer is, it's all these, the same political answer, because a lot of people who are very influential don't want to pay taxes. And they've been running the show, in many ways, in all our democracies. And that's where I'm actually very hopeful, with the next Democratic president, that this problem will be more effectively addressed. It is one of the reasons why the issue, it's not just tax avoidance. The Panama Papers, which was this exposure of what went on, and there's a beautiful movie called Laundering.
Yeah, I watched it 2 days ago, and it's amazing.
It's a very...
It's funny and interesting.
Yeah, so based on the Panama Papers... Laundromat, yeah. And based on the Panama Papers, it's something you would all enjoy. But it shows that it's not just tax evasion and avoidance. It's money laundering, drug money, corruption, all kinds of human trafficking. Anything bad you think of, it's in the Panama Papers. It is really quite amazing. I should tell a little story. After the Panama Papers came out, I got a call from the Vice President of Panama asking if I would be on a commission to reform Panama because they felt that their reputation had been damaged, and they felt very bad about it. So I was a little suspicious. I didn't know, but she flew up and made a very strong case for why they wanted to reform, and they were putting together a commission, and they had a very good former person from the OECD who's done a lot of good work on corruption, anti-bribery, and that kind of thing. So I joined the commission, and then we began our work. But one of the I was actually a co-chair. Then I said one of the ground rules we have to make clear as we're beginning our work is we have to be transparent in everything we do. We will make recommendations. Whether you accept them or not is another question. But we will have to be, how can we have credibility in promoting transparency if we weren't ourselves transparent? And I didn't get an answer, and I didn't get an answer, and I didn't get an answer. And finally, they said, no, we are absolutely committed to lack of transparency. And I had to resign, and the guys who from the OECD, Switzerland, had to resign. And then they got more bad publicity out of our resignation than they had gotten from their attempt to get good publicity. And it showed up at one moment in a televised session at Davos the next year, where we had a discussion about with one of the other tax avoiders, senators in Europe is Ireland. So the finance minister at Davos, there was a session with me and the finance minister of Ireland and a couple of other people. And at the end of the session, and we were talking about Apple and how Ireland had done these secret deals with Ireland effectively to pay 0.002% of taxes as they were booking money from the rest of Europe as profits in Ireland and then not paying any taxes. Just incredible. But he was very good-natured about it. But at the end, they had a brief question and answer period, and the first person to raise their question was the finance minister from Panama, who said something about, you haven't talked about other places. And I said, well, I haven't had time. And then I explained, I had a document of a report that we had written about how terrible Panama was. So he gave me a chance to explain the reforms that needed to be done in Panama. Now, one of the silver linings in the cloud that's Trump is that Americans have become much more aware of money laundering. Because we have a president who's the money launderer in chief. And the point of that, mentioning that, is it is not just the Cayman Islands, it's not just Luxembourg, but it's the United States. It's Delaware, it's Nevada, and it's London, which used to be, still part of the EU, but they promised that if they're not part of the EU, they'll be even worse. And you can't allow them to do that. But the point is, it's not just through the banking system, it's through real estate that a lot of the money laundering. And we know what has to be done. There are principles of how to stop this kind of money laundering and other cross-border transactions that facilitate corruption and have all these other kinds of nefarious effects. And, you know, this is one of those, there aren't many areas where things are black and white, you know, so clear. And I think this is really clear. And the research that you've just described and the research that other people have been doing of showing the magnitude of this, I hopefully have put a spotlight on this that will motivate political action. Now, just one more remark. One aspect, which is not the fiscal paradises, the Cayman Islands, is tax avoidance legal through the multinational enterprises. That was another aspect that I talked about in the chapter. And that's where the OECD is involved in an effort called the base erosion and profit shifting, where the multinationals shift their profits to low-tax jurisdictions, like Ireland or Luxembourg. So this is all done legally. It's not shadowy. I mean, except it's shadowy. You know, Apple really is the poster child of this, because they had a secret agreement with Ireland that no one else knew about. And if this became a standard way of behaving, the taxes collected in Europe from multinationals would be zero. You know, it was clear what they were doing is behavior which, if you ask the categorical imperative, the golden rule, if everybody did it, what would the outcome be? And it would totally eviscerate the tax system, corporate tax system of Europe. But that's not their concern. Their concern is maximizing the money for their shareholders. And just a couple weeks ago, the OECD came out with a proposal to address it. And I wrote an op-ed where I say it canonizes the concept of gradualism. It actually isn't significantly addressing the issue. The fundamental problem is what is called the transfer price system. And we have to go away from that to what is called a formulaic system, which is the system that is which is evolving in Europe towards corporate income tax. And no one in the United States would dream of using the transfer price system. We use the formulaic system. But the system that was put in place almost 100 years ago, called the transfer price system, is an invitation for tax avoidance. And the OECD has not really bitten the bullet and said, that's the real source of the problem, and we have to get rid of it.
Thanks. We have a last topic, maybe something more positive. As you know, the financial sector has, on the surface, taken over the debate on climate change. So the question is, can we trust? Can we trust the banks? What about a climate bank? What do you think about this a new trend, very fashionable? What do you think about that?
Well, I think green is better than brown. So I think that it is a good thing that they're beginning to think about climate finance. And there are some banks that are doing really a very good job. But it's a little bit like in the years after we became aware of how the cigarette companies were producing this product, which is still consumed a lot in France, which is killing people, the banks continue to lend them money to enable them to kill more people. And you say, you know, is that social responsibility? And their answer was, no, we have green light bulbs. So we're making our social responsibility by having green light bulbs. And how do you contrast having green light bulbs with lending money for expanding coal mining? I mean, so they were good in the small, but rather bad in the large. So the good news is that there is a serious focus in the financial community now about a number of aspects of climate change that I think will be moving them gradually in the right direction. But let me give you some examples. So there are what are called green bonds. So they're trying to set up standards of what are investments that qualify for helping the environment, transforming our economy to a green transition. So green bonds, I think, are a good thing, and I think they've been working, and they've been expanding very, very rapidly. The central bankers, led by Mark Carnoy, who's head of the Bank of England, have been getting together and trying to think about issues of the risk of financial instability caused by carbon. The idea here is that, just to give one example, we know that the amount of oil and gas that has been discovered and that can be produced at relatively low cost is beyond our carbon budget. What I mean by carbon budget is if we burned all that, we would be roasting. It would be warmer than it's in this room. It would be more than 4 degrees increasing centigrade. So we know that we can't use all the oil, gas, and coal that we have discovered. So at some point of time, there will be what are called stranded assets. Assets that have a value today, and we will say, you can't use them. So those assets are going to go from a high value to zero. And if banks are holding those assets, some banks may go bankrupt. But it's not only if the banks are holding it, if they've lent to a company that has those as their assets, the company may go bankrupt. So there's a lot of complicated network analysis that has to be done. And so the central banks are beginning to focus on this issue of what is the systemic risk that is being posed by not addressing carbon in a very forceful and timely way. And they're coming up with a framework for dealing with it. In the United States, several states are beginning to require disclosure of carbon risk on your annual returns. You know, when you say when you file, every year you're supposed to file what are the risks facing the company, and one of them is carbon risk.
We're discussing the same kind of reforms in Europe.
We're moving. I think several states already do that, and some states, New York is if I recall, is basically charging Exxon with not fully disclosing its carbon risk and saying that was a violation of its obligations under the disclosure laws. So there are a lot of things, and there's also a beginning of a change of or discussion of a change of fiduciary notions. Pension funds have a fiduciary responsibility to their pensioners, and what does that mean? And unfortunately, in the past, what it's meant is that the pension funds can only focus on short-term returns. And there's now a beginning to say, no, you ought to really focus on long-term. Long-term means you have to focus on carbon. And so making it a fiduciary obligation to look at the carbon risk that is embedded in assets. In the end, I think there needs to be created a whole set of green banks, probably public banks, because I think it's going to be too hard to get the private sector to move fast enough. And we've done that in New York State. We have, the state of New York has created a green bank.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and it's actually working well, and it's making loans. So it's a public bank. You think that America doesn't, but New York and California are not.
Yes, okay.
Anyway, so hopefully we are leading the way and leading the rest of the country and the rest of the world to have some of these institutions.
Okay, thanks. We have a lot of questions, but I know that my colleague and the students have also a lot of questions for you. So if you don't mind, I will take some questions from the audience. So present yourself, and if you want to ask some question to Professor Stiglitz. Does it work? Okay. Don't be shy. The
Hi.
conference is for you.
So we are very happy to have you here at Sorbonne. My question is about profit shifting and tax evasion that you mentioned now. So my question is about profit shifting and tax evasion. So like you said, Apple and Google are not paying their fair share of taxes. Do you think that taxing them based on the location of their clients would be an efficient way to attenuate this problem? Thank you.
I think the best way to do it is in the kinds of proposals that this independent commission that I'm on has tried to enunciate, which is a general formulaic approach that applies to all companies with special provisions of how you deal with the digital companies. So we've tried to provide an overall framework of how you deal with the problem more generally. But that's going to take time. And I don't think it's conscionable to allow the digital companies, simply because they're digital, to avoid taxes. Particularly, they become such an important source of profits in the global economy today. I mean, in fact, in the United States, about 85% of all the increase in the stock market value has been in these GAFAs. So for them not to be taxed gives them an unfair advantage over your local store, the bricks and mortar store, and so forth. So I think the kind of proposal that France has put forward of a tax on the revenues that they're getting from French consumers or advertisers is absolutely right, until we get that global approach. My only complaint is it's probably too small, significantly too small, and it should be raised. the bubble. What I wanted to emphasize is those imbalances themselves are macroeconomic phenomena, but the bad decisions about how that money was spent, that was a microeconomic decision. You could have, presumably with low interest rates or with those flows, helped Spain develop more industrial capacity or more capacity in some other sectors of the economy. One of the remarkable things that the world went through is this period of very low interest rates, which should have stimulated a lot of real investment. And it didn't. It went into, I say in the United States, into shoddy houses built in the middle of the Nevada desert. And that was the fault of the banks, but it was also the fault of the regulators and supervisors who should have said, you're putting at risk our economy. Now, on the second question, on corporate responsibility, I think you have to put the issue in a broader context as what is the objective of the firm, what should they be maximizing? And that's been a long controversy, a long subject of debate. The predominant, the view, say, in Germany was very clear, was called stakeholder capitalism. You look at shareholders, but also the well-being of workers and the communities in which you operate, your customers. You pay attention to all. It's not as easy as having a single bottom line, but you have a governing system, a board of directors, where you have workers represented, and you may have community represented, and they try to balance those various concerns. What happened is that in the late 1970s, early 1980s, Milton Friedman and the right, who were strong ideologues, put forward this idea that shareholder value maximization would lead to economic efficiency and was what the objective of the firm should be. Milton Friedman wrote some very influential papers, and he got a Nobel Prize for his work, but most of his life he was devoted to being an ideologue and putting forward really political ideas. That was one. And I felt very sensitive about it because I had written a paper several years before he started this campaign, pointing out that shareholder value maximization was not welfare maximizing. And he didn't bother to refute my paper. And no one's refuted it in 40 years. He's right. But he was very successful in getting every state in the United States to change their law. And the good news is that after this concerted campaign and after in the United States and after the exposure of the opioid crisis, the financial behavior, the food companies leading to a diabetes, childhood diabetes, a whole set of corporate scandals, almost all of our corporate leaders have said, we want to go back to stakeholder capitalism. Shareholder capitalism isn't working. They said that because Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders said, if you don't say that, we're going to change the law anyway. And they wanted to get ahead of the game. I don't believe what they're saying, but I think we're likely to have a change in the law.
So I have a microphone. So no, I think you answered more or less, so you've been discussing that. So there's very hot debate about short-termism in the US. And I always have this in mind, that is that really the fault of the capital market? So is the capital market wrong in providing a value that may, over the long term, incentivize the actors correctly? Is that the fault of the incentive compensation, the way the incentive compensation is tailored? And I think it's extremely prevalent in banks where bankers are paid on return on equity. They were 10 years ago. They are still now. If you look at their incentive compensation, which is really a pain. And the last thing is maybe this is the fault of the representation that actors have of what the market have in mind or the way the market is functioning. And I think there are plenty of examples where you can see that the market is not fooled by some decision of firm that are pretending increasing the market value. And so my question would be, you know, what's the role of incentive compensation in all that, and can we change that? Is there a way to change that?
Yeah, I think the stock market, stock option incentive compensation schemes have played a very important role in encouraging bad behavior and encouraging what we call short-termism, thinking about the short term. The fact is, you know, the companies sell the idea of stock options that you have to incentivize the executives to work hard. That argument is really a bad argument on two grounds. First, or several grounds. One of them is, think about a doctor, a heart surgeon. You don't go up to a heart surgeon and say, you know, I'm going to give you a bonus if I live. And the heart surgeon say, oh, thank you very much, because otherwise I wasn't going to concentrate. I would be thinking about, my weekend, or, You're a professional. And as a professional, as a heart surgeon, you're doing the best you can. And if you're hired to be the CEO of a company, you're entrusted with these human capital, the resources. You should be a professional. You should be thankful that they've given you this responsibility, and you should be working as hard as you can. And there are countries, in Norway, a lot of the CEOs do not get paid these excessive amounts. In Japan, they don't get paid these excessive amounts, and they work just as hard. The idea that you have to pay $50 million to get the CEO off of the golf course seems to me absurd. There are lots of people who are willing to get off the golf course and work hard without that. In fact, there's a lot of research, again, in behavioral economics that focusing on financial incentives actually discourages good behavior. And so it actually has adverse effect. But there's another objection that, I've written a lot about, which is if you actually were to design a good incentive scheme, it would not look like any of the CEO incentive schemes that we have. Because you look at the CEO incentive schemes, take an airplane company, their pay goes up when stock price goes up. What is the major determinant of the fluctuations in the stock market price?
Oil price.
The price of oil. That has nothing to do, maybe if they take their airplane and they bomb Iraq, they can have effect on the price of, but that's not what United Airlines does. So they have nothing to do, their behavior is not the major determinant of the stock of price, the stock of their share. If they were really concerned about incentives, they would, there is a way of extracting those exogenous sources of perturbations to their stock prices, and you would have, for instance, rewards based on relative performance of others in your industry. And I've talked to CEOs and I've asked them this question: is it because you're stupid that you don't do it this way, or because you want to deceive your shareholders? And most of them say, yeah, I'm a little stupid, but now that you've explained it to me, I'm bright enough to understand what you said, and now, yeah, I want to deceive my shareholders. So the fact is that both elements are present, and that leads to the answer to the last part of your question. There's a lot of market irrationality in the market, and the head of Citibank said that in a very vivid way when he was asked, why did you behave so stupidly in the financial market? And he said, as long as the music plays, I have to keep dancing. And everybody's doing it. And there was one CEO of a bank of a leading American investment bank who said, "This is crazy. I want to get off," and he diminished some of his lending, and he was fired. So that was an important lesson. You better do what everybody else is doing. That's not a lesson for the students, though.
We have time for a last question. So,
Yeah. Well, let me answer your question both more broadly and then the specifics. In all these areas where there's bad behavior, in the corporate behavior, in the case of food, and in the case of climate change, the public policy needs to be a mixture of incentives, taxes, and regulations. And trying to get that right balance between incentives and regulations is difficult. A lot of economists think that you should only use taxes. I think that's wrong. And there's no theoretical basis for that. And I just written a paper trying to explain why the carbon tax is not the only solution. It may be part of a bundle of policies. Simple regulations can be very effective, like simply not allowing any coal-burning electric generator. It's not hard to enforce, and it has a very big effect on greenhouse gas emissions. And the same thing is true about energy efficient standards, emission standards for automobiles. It's only one tool. Another tool is infrastructure investment. Another tool is various kinds of incentives. So in the case of food, there is always one of the complicated issues in facing any public policy are issues of distribution versus equity. If you impose, versus the incentives. So if you had a fast food, the fact of the matter is that fast food may be eaten disproportionately by low-income people. And so a tax leads to an increase in their consumption. Mayor Bloomberg in New York proposed a very simple regulation. In the movie theaters, you cannot sell jumbo non-diet soft drinks. So you make it, you don't stop them from drinking, but you make it, it's a time tax. They have to go back and forth and getting, if they want to drink, they have to interrupt seeing the movie. There are lots of things like that where you can work. Another regulation, you mentioned advertising. One of the big battles in the United States has been over foods served in school cafeterias, because you want to change people's norms, what their beliefs are. And norm changing is really difficult, but schools are one of the places where people get used to what is the kind of food that I'm going to be used to. But one of the big another battle in the United States is whether you should have these sweet foods, very sugary foods with vending machines near schools. And again, changing access is more effective in many ways than increasing the price by 20%. You know, so it costs 30 cents rather than 25 cents. They're still going to eat it. But making it so they have to walk 20 minutes to find that, that's too high of a price for them to pay. So coming to understand what drives people's behavior may be more important than just thinking about a tax. But this is one of those areas where there are very strong externalities, there's very strong social costs. And this, you know, I mentioned the epidemic of childhood diabetes in the United States is one of the factors that is contributing to the decrease in life expectancy in the United States. I mean, we have a real health problem. And so it is an area that I think is very important for us to take action.
Thank you. So unfortunately it's time, so thank you very much. We were very, very happy to welcome you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you